Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to compare two different approaches for updating stuff outside of the current locality with HTMX. And these approaches are the hx-swap-oob and hx-on. If we take a look at this example, we have this input and then we have this text that says no last item. And this is what our current locality is. We are working currently within this div that is going to update itself by using Golang on the backend and HTMX on the front end. But what we also want to do is we want to have the ability to update different parts of our web application by either using the approach of out-of-band swap or using event-driven architecture. Or in other words, we want to be able to emit events to a certain part of our web application and have that part of the application update itself. During this video, we are going to start with the theory. So we are going to see the pros and cons for each one of these approaches. And then we are going to see how the code works within our code editor. And we are using again HTMX and Golang. So by the end of it, we are going to see this result. So we can type here something like hello world. And if we press return, not only does this update, and this is the locality that we are currently working within, but this also updates here outside of the current scope of this input and this last item text. Now let's hop into Excalidraw and let's take a look at the pros and cons for each one of these approaches. So let's start with the out-of-band approach, and the first pro is that we do not require additional requests. So usually we make a request from our front end using HTMX, it goes to our Go backend, and then the backend not only sends back the quote-unquote primary HTML that we want to replace inside of the DOM, but it also sends additional elements with the hx-swap-oob attribute. And by doing that, HTMX is going to look within the DOM and it is going to replace those elements with the elements that are coming from the backend. And then it is going to ignore those elements when doing the replacing of the primary element that we want to replace, which we specify with the hx-target attribute. And by using this approach, we do not require additional round trips to the server, which makes our web application more performant. The second pro is that this is a simpler mental model for us to understand. So we have again the primary response and then we have additional elements, and HTMX is going to look within the DOM, is going to see if it can find them, and then it is going to replace them. We don't have to think about different events occurring inside of the browser and all those kind of stuff. So instead we have this very simple mental model, which is easy to understand, and as a result it makes our code easier to understand, to write, and so on and so on. And the final pro is that it does not require any additional APIs for us to understand. In the other example with the events, it requires us to understand how the browser works when it comes to events, and it also requires us to have to spend some more time learning all those details and exactly how that stuff works. Now, this might not really be a con of the other approach, and that's because it is always useful to understand how the browser event works and how we can take advantage of them to be able to create better web applications, but it is still a pro of the out-of-band approach, and that also ties a bit into the previous pro of a simpler mental model, so we don't have to understand a bunch of different stuff. We let HTMX take care of most of the work. We simply add an attribute and then HTMX does everything that it needs to do in order to replace the content inside of the DOM outside of the current scope that we are working within. Now let's take a look at the cons of this approach, and the first one is that it adds more complexity to our backend with multiple updates. So we can think of it like this. if we are making a request to our backend and then we want to replace multiple parts of our frontend, then we need to, inside of our controller or handler, have a bunch more logic to be able to fetch all that data to be sent back to the browser and then be replaced in each specific location of the DOM. And this usually means that we have to add a lot more logic in our backend, and it makes our controllers or handlers again much more complex, and it adds a lot more code to those parts of our web application. And the second con is that the API or the mental model is exclusive to HTMX. So by learning this approach of doing the out-of-band swap, we are not really able to learn this and then transfer this knowledge to other tools like LiveView or Livewire, but instead we are learning something that is exclusive to HTMX. Now, this might not be a con for you if you want to learn HTMX and use it in the long run, but this is something to keep in mind, and that is this approach of doing the out-of-band, so having a quote-unquote primary element response and then having other elements inside of that response that are going to be replaced in different parts of the application and ignored in that primary replacing inside of the DOM. So this mental model and this approach is something that is exclusive to HTMX. Now let's take a look at the other approach of using events, and this usually means using the hx-on attribute on our elements, which HTMX provides us with to be able to listen to events that are dispatched to those elements. So the first pro is that this provides us with more modularity. So in the other approach, I mentioned how we usually have to send a request to the backend, and then the backend has to process a lot of stuff to be able to then replace different parts of our web application in the frontend. But in this case, we have a lot more modularity, and that's because each one of those parts of our web application that we are not currently working with, so that are outside of the current scope, those parts can take care of replacing the DOM themselves and can even do stuff like make requests to the backend to request additional data. So let's say that we are using a web application and we are currently logged in as user 1, and we toggle a drop down and then we click on the user 2, which means we want to switch to a different user, and then a different part of the application that is displaying our email address and the avatar, for example, can simply listen to that quote-unquote switch user event and then make a request to the backend requesting the new email address and the avatar image, for example, and then display the new email and the new avatar, and this leads to a much modular system that is easier usually to maintain. Then the second pro is that the events that we use with HTMX are easier to reuse with the browser or client-only APIs. And one example that's easy to understand is that let's say that we have a toast notification that we want to use across our web application. So in that case, we can not only trigger that toast notification by using a, for example, Go backend, but we can also trigger the toast notification from the client. So by simply, for example, using the console and then adding a function to our window object, and then we can trigger that same toast notification by either using the client only or using events that are coming from the backend with HTMX. And this is great because we might have certain parts of our web application that we want to reuse again across the server and the client, and the toast notifications are a perfect example. We might want to click on a button that copies to the clipboard and we want to instantly show to the user on that toast notification that a particular text was copied to the clipboard. And by using that same toast notification, we can show to the user that, for example, a post was updated after going to the backend and then the confirmation coming back. Now let's take a look at the cons of this approach, and the first one is that it requires additional requests and extra round trips to the server. Now this is usually a balance that we have to keep in mind, and we need to sort of decide where it makes more sense to do additional requests to the server or have a more complex controller or handler, but this is a con of this approach. It requires more requests to the server than the other approach, and that can create a bad user experience in the end. And finally, the last con is that this is a more complex mental model. So when we are building our web application, we need to keep in mind all of these events, where they are being sent to, what exactly those elements are doing when the event gets triggered, and so on and so on. So the other approach is much simpler. We have the primary response, we have the quote-unquote secondary responses, the out-of-band swaps that we let HTMX replace within the DOM based on the IDs, and that's a much simpler approach, a much simpler mental model, and in the case of events we have to do a lot more work, but as a result it can make our web application experience better in the end. To recap, there are pros and cons for each one of these approaches, and the most important thing is for you to give them a try inside of your web application and see which one not only do you prefer to work with, but also which one makes more sense for your particular web application that you are currently working with. If you want to learn more about how to build web applications with HTMX, Go, and PostgreSQL, then go to webdevfuel.com/hgsb or click the link in the description down below to join the HTMX Go SaaS Blueprint. Now let's hop into the code editor and let's take a look at the code examples. First, we want to take a look at the example for the out-of-band approach, and if you also want to have access to this code example, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below, and you can move to this branch to take a look at the example for this approach. First, we have inside of our base layout this div with the ID of form with latest item. Then we have this component form with latest item that takes two different arguments. First, the latest item value, and then a boolean value that we'll call out of band, so we know if this is an out of band swap operation or not. And by default, when we initially render this, we pass the value as an empty string and out of band as false. Then we have this form template that also has a form element with the following attributes. We have first of all the hx-target, which specifies which target we want to replace after we submit this form. So we are going to send a request to our Go backend, and then the Go backend is going to send back the quote-unquote primary response, and to let HTMX know which part of the DOM we want to replace with that HTML response, we specify here the target. So we say form with latest item, which is the ID that we had up here. Then we specify the path and the method that we want to use when submitting this form. So we say that we want to make a request to the backend with the post method to /items. Then we have the item input value here, where we specify the item name, and we also have a button to submit this form. Then we have the latest item template, and we pass as an argument the value, which is a string, and if the value equals an empty string, we want to show an empty state message, and if not, we want to show the title, and we also want to call this item template with both arguments. First of all, the value, which is the exact same one that we pass here, so we grab the value from the arguments and we pass them down to this component, and we also pass this last argument, which is going to be the out-of-bound boolean value as false. Now let's take a look at this item template, which is not only being used up here, but also here where we just saw inside of this template. So this is going to take again two different arguments, the value which is a string and out of band which is a boolean. And then if this is an out of band swap, we want to first of all specify the ID, which is all items, and then we want to say here hx-swap-oob equals before end. Now we could either add here a true, which would tell HTMX to look inside of the DOM and simply replace what it finds with this element, or we can specify a swapping strategy, and then HTMX is going to use that swapping strategy to replace stuff inside of the DOM. So by specifying this before end swapping strategy, HTMX is going to add this element after the last child of this all items element. And the result here is going to be a list where we can add a new item at the bottom each time that we insert it. And again, if we pay close attention to this, we have both of these templates, which are the quote-unquote primary response that HTMX is going to replace by looking for this ID and then replacing the stuff inside. And then we have this template, and since we pass out of band as true, then this is going to have this ID and this hx-swap-oob attribute, and it is going to be quote-unquote ignored in the primary response. So it is not going to be used when replacing this element, but instead HTMX is going to look inside of the DOM for this ID, and it is going to use this swapping strategy that we've specified to replace the things inside of the DOM, or in this case simply attach a new element after the last child. Now let's take a look at the handlers, and this is pretty simple. When we navigate to the base path of our web server, we are going to render this index template. So if we take a look, this is what we want to render on the initial request to our web server when we visit the page inside of the browser. And then when we make requests with the post method to /items, we are going to grab this form value with the key of item, and we are going to render this form with latest item with the value that we grab from the form, and then with swap-oob set as true. And the result is going to be the following. We visit this page, we have this message that says no last item, and then if we insert here, for example, hello world, we are going to see here now last item and the latest item that we've inserted. And not only that, but HTMX is also going to look within the DOM. It is going to find the div that we want to attach a new item to, and it is going to correctly insert it here. And if we say that we also want to add another item, it is going to be added here at the bottom, so we can see the list of items that we've inserted, and we can also see here part of the, again, quote-unquote primary response, here this latest item that was inserted. Now let's go over the other approach of using events, and more specifically of using hx-on. So again, if you want to take a look at this code example, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below. And for this one, you can move to the hx-on branch to see this particular code example. And if we take a look at this, there are a couple of changes here compared to the previous example. So first, we don't have to pass any kind of swap-oob boolean value here, and that's because we are not using that strategy here inside of this example. We still need to specify here the ID for the quote-unquote primary response, and we also need to pass both the form and the latest item with the value when we are not only initially rendering this, so when we initially render it, we pass this as an empty string, but also after we make the request where we post a new item to the backend, and then we pass here the value that was passed via the form. Then if we take a look at the latest item template, we also pass in the exact same way the value, which is a string, and if the value equals an empty string, we render the empty state, and if not, we want to pass the title and the item. But in this case, the item only requires the value, and not the other Boolean value that tells it if this is a swap-oob operation or not. And if we take a look at this template, we only need to add here this p element, and then we pass here the value. Now let's navigate to the sidebar.template file and let's take a look at exactly how we are adding a new item to our list each time that it gets inserted. So first of all, we have this script down here, which is pretty simple. We want to first of all say document.body.add-event-listener. So we want to add a new event listener to the body, and we want to listen for the event add item. And then when we get this event triggered, then we want to look for each one of the elements inside of our web application that have this attribute that says data all items. And for each one of these elements that we find, we want to use this HTMX.trigger function, and we need to pass 3 different arguments. First of all, we want to pass the element that we want to trigger this event on. Then we want to say what the event name is. And finally, we need to pass the detail, which we are simply going to grab from up here. So we have the detail that we are going to get from our backend. And then we pass the exact same detail here, which will include the item value. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that this approach of looking for all of the elements that have this attribute and then triggering this event for each one of them ties directly into the modularity that we were talking about in the theory part. So by doing this, we essentially have the ability to let each one of these elements know that this event was triggered, and then each one of these elements are going to do what they want with this information. So we simply pass this event name, we pass the information that we have about this event, and then the element is going to do what it wants with it. It can either show, for example, a toast notification, or it can add to a list, it can show the latest item, it can do whatever it wants with it. Now, in this case, we only have one element inside of the page here, and that's this one. We have this div element, which has the ID of all items, and then it has this attribute data all items. And then we want to listen to the event by saying here hx-on :add-item. So if you recall, this is the exact same event that we triggered down here. And then when this event gets triggered, we want to first of all create a new p element. So we say here document.create-element, and then we pass the tag that we want to create. Then we specify the class name, and then we also specify the text content by grabbing this content from the detail. So we say here event.detail.value, and finally, to be able to insert this similarly to the other case before end, we say this, which refers to the element, and then we say dot insert adjacent element, and we pass 2 different arguments. First of all, we say here before end, and then we pass the element that we want to insert. And again, this is going to insert this element after the last child of this div element. Now let's take a look at our handlers, and this is mostly the exact same thing as with the previous example. The only thing that we need to include here that was not in the previous example is this line. So we want to say here dub.header.set, which means we want to set a new response header. We pass the key, which is hx-trigger, and then we pass here a JSON object where the key is the event name that we want to send back to the browser. And then we pass here the detail, which is also an object. So this is going to be the detail that we are going to then have available to us inside of the browser. And we specify the value, which is the key. And then we pass here the value. So we use this function to replace this part with the value that we grab from the form. Now let's move back to the browser and let's give this a try again. So if we type here hello world, not only do we see here this title and the latest item, but we also now see here the item's title and then the latest item inserted. And as we insert new items, we are going to get them appended here to the bottom. So if we say also here new item 2, we are going to see here a list of all the items that we've inserted, and then we are always going to see here the latest item inserted also. So this is it. This is a comparison of using the hx-swap-oob approach and the hx-on approach. Both of these approaches are valid and they have again their pros and cons, like we went over in the theory part. And the important thing here to keep in mind is that there's no quote-unquote better way of doing this. It is a matter of, first of all, preference when it comes to the web developer. So you should give this a try inside of your web applications and see which approach you like more. And then it is also a matter of having each one of these approaches work better for a particular type of web application based on the requirements. So I hope this video was helpful to you, and I'll see you on the next one.